So good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're so excited that we have Greg Kulik here from EdTech Teacher. And Greg, as well as another consultant from EdTech Teacher, have been providing training for our staff in remote learning, Google Classroom, creating engaging lessons for our students through that remote lens. And we thought it would be nice for Greg to come and give you an overview of just kind of what is digital learning and what's been happening and a little bit of what he shared with our teachers, and then he'll answer some questions. So if you have any questions, you can put in the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom of your screen. And so we have about 50 minutes, which probably isn't a whole lot of time. It's going to go by really fast. But one of the things that I want to express is that we're all learning this together. So Greg's been so wonderful to be teaching myself and all the teachers, but as you as parents are learning too as we navigate all this. So before I turn it over to Greg, though, I just want to introduce Dr. Sullivan. He's here too, and so both of us are just really happy to have Greg here. So Greg, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Fantastic, thank you. So good evening, everyone. The first thing I want to say is I just really value the opportunity to connect with all of you. I'm a former high school history teacher. I taught at Plymouth South High School for about 10 years. I lived on the South Shore in Plymouth for about 10 years. These days I'm up on the North Shore, so you don't have to hold that against me that I left the South Shore. I have little ones of my own. I have a third grader and a first grader, and I went through the kind of challenges of the spring. So I absolutely recognize the kind of environment that we're in right now. So like Dr. Scollin said, I was really fortunate to be able to work with the district and work with teachers in Cohasset Public Schools to maybe help kind of paint a picture for what kind of the core principles and ideas and philosophy behind high quality online learning. And I think one really important thing to keep in mind before I even jump into the slides and the material, and I'll actually give all of that to you. We'll make that link available. So if you want to dig into the readings on your own, you're kind of more than welcome to do that. Is that in many regards, what happened in the spring, I don't even really define it. And I think a lot of people working in this field of, teaching and learning online don't necessarily define that as online learning. In many ways, that was like emergency management. It was like, oh my goodness, there's a health crisis going on. Our schools are getting shut down. Everyone's expected to turn on a dime. There's no precedent for this at all. And honestly, we're hoping that in the work that we're doing to prepare the teachers and the kind of growth and the progress that they're going to work through over time, we can create just really high quality experiences for every learner in the district. But I think that's a really clear distinction to make. So kind of with that as some of the backdrop, I'm going to jump into some of the ideas that I like to share with you. So I'm just going to push my video forward a bit. Dr. Scollins, is my video nice and big for you now? Just want to make sure. Yes, perfect. Okay. So here, I want to share a lot of the ideas that I talked about with the teachers. So you have a sense of what was some of the context that they were presented with. And I think that'll help you understand maybe where they're coming from. And one of the ideas here is that we have to kind of calibrate the perspective of what are the students now in reality? So traditionally, we might say as a really natural entry point of my kids are still face-to-face learners who happen to engage with some online experiences, right? And that can really inform the way you're thinking about the online space. And one of the ideas that I presented to the teachers and a lens to have to think about what's going on now is what if we were to shift our thinking and we go, okay, we're not necessarily going to think about these students as online learners that face-to-face that happen to go online, and then the online is impacting my face-to-face instruction. What we might think more about is, what if we took the lens of, my students are online learners. And I think this is the most reasonable approach to take. They're online learners primarily. And then I get to supplement that experience with the face-to-face time. And then it changes the way that I think about the face-to-face time. And we'll get into this a bit with thinking about the language of synchronous or asynchronous, and even maybe shifting that language a bit to adopt maybe more accessible language of things like self-paced or independent or live interactions. If we can take this kind of lower this kind of bottom rung here of thinking about what the experience is, the districts all across the country, there's scenarios where kids might come in 2 days a week. and then Wednesday we're closed or totally independent, and then Thursday and Friday the cohorts flip-flop, or students are in school until 11:30 every day. And if we look at the total amount of time that they're in school versus engaging online, in many instances, the majority of their experience is going online. So I was kind of pushing the teachers to consider the idea of, if they're online learners and we can take that perspective, then we're able to start to design for that experience. Everyone's an online learner. What are the kinds of experiences? What is the content that I can put in that online space? How can I support my learners in an online space that's like age and grade level appropriate? And then when I get to have them come into my classroom, what are the things that I could only accomplish when we're face-to-face? What are the sorts of interactions that lend themselves to a face-to-face interaction? One of the lenses that I was trying to get them to kind of think through and adopt is, traditionally, when we'd walk into a classroom, we're planning for what might happen that day. We're planning for the content we're going to explore. We're planning for the skills that we're trying to develop or the standards that we're trying to meet. If we're now shifted to an online environment where our learners are primarily online learners, we might have to start to think more about interaction. And that was one of the lenses of, if we can think about planning for interaction, then we can go, okay, what can be put online? What can only be done effectively face-to-face? And what is the interaction and the experience that I'm designing, not necessarily covering content? And we'll get into this a bit. There's certain things that play out based on research in this field and based on like really high quality practice. There's certain things that are really well suited for like live experience. And there's certain things that are really well suited for independent experience. But I also recognize at the kind of entry level, it's really challenging to kind of shift the perspective. And like, there's a really reasonable question that was posted. Is it realistic to think of our very young elementary learners as online learners? I would say no. We're not saying K and 1, and like, I have a 1 and 3 in my own home, right? So are they totally independent online learners? Not necessarily. But one of the lenses we can take is, and I presented to the teachers, is like proximity to the idea, or proximity to the content, or proximity to the student. So is it possible to go, for example, like my little guy's exploring number bonds, right? Is it reasonable to have that, that student explore number bonds in an online environment? I think it's pretty reasonable at that first grade level. But then what are they doing in the face-to-face environment that's like can only be accomplished in that face-to-face environment? And maybe it's discussions around number bonds, or practice face-to-face around that experience, or the students discussing it with the teacher. So I think we have to consider, like, when we think about online learners, traditionally, and this is a lot what happened in the spring, is that online learning was defined as like live, synchronous, face-to-face calls where the teacher is teaching through Zoom or teaching through Google Meet for extended amount of time over the course of the day. And I think we can really shift that to go, what are reasonably designed, self-paced experiences, independent experience that are supported by teacher video, teacher audio, a really well-designed experience that's like one that a student can navigate with maybe a little bit of guidance by the guardian or the parent or the caregiver, but not complete all hands on deck to help the student through that experience. And then how is the teacher designing for the experience and the interaction face-to-face, not necessarily leaning on teaching those ideas face-to-face. But I get there's challenges. And like I was talking with Dr. Scollins before we even met for tonight, and it's like, hey, we're in a growth process here. Like, in even whatever research and best practice says, no research and no best practice has happened during a pandemic where kids have been like, the whole schedule's been upended. Research and best practice around online learning has taken place like in a vacuum, not with what's going on now. We'll get to that a bit more as well. So another really kind of interesting idea that I want to present and share with you is, you can see this is a little bit of a back and forth in a discussion between myself and Eric Hudson. So Eric is the director of the Global Online Academy, right? So they've been doing work with online instruction for years. They run online classes across the country for students. And in all of my experience, what I've been kind of experiencing personally and with every school that I've worked with is that it can take 3, 4, even 5 times as long to prepare high quality online experiences And I wanted to know what people thought about that. Thankfully, Eric replied with his expertise of like, that seems about right. So whatever the teacher may have prepared face-to-face, say it would take an hour to prep for the entire day or 2 hours to prep for the day, we're talking 6, 7, 8 hours to prepare for that same amount of content designed online, whether that's like a synchronous call or an independent experience. And this is part of the learning curve that everyone is going through. Can I work as a teacher more efficiently? Can I work what Eric is suggesting of working through kind of like templates or frameworks that we can use over and over again so the student can get really comfortable with what that online experience is going to look like, and the teacher can build it pretty effectively and efficiently. I think one of the challenges is that as everyone is learning as they're going right now, like this is universal across the country. Are we able to, within a reasonable amount of time, kind of develop an approach that can work with the teachers within the skills and abilities and the time constraints that they have, and we can make meaningful, super high quality, kind of well-designed experiences for the students, but there's a super kind of like steep learning curve here. Right. So even in the amount of time I've been able to work with the Cohasset school teachers, it's like making them aware of even the tools that are already in place. How can you start to leverage those tools to do things like create opportunities for students to share their thinking through multiple modalities even? So especially for those emerging readers, right? We can't put them in an online environment with text as the only level of interaction and expect them to be able to navigate that. So how can we pair text with self-paced teacher video where the teacher can welcome them, guide them, possibly even read through the activity or the idea, or present the information via video and text and a visual. So these are like some of the skills that we're developing right now. Or if we're talking about maybe upper elementary students, can we even create opportunities where those students can share their thinking, not necessarily through text as the only way to share their thinking in a digital environment? Right, so these are some of the ideas that we're starting to explore and developing comfort with. So I want to keep going with kind of clearly defining what we mean by high quality online instruction. So there tends to be like 5 kind of tent poles or 5 characteristics of high quality online instruction. Like some of them don't really apply to kind of our conversation tonight, but I think the one that I've highlighted is the one that we really want to see teachers like thoughtfully kind of engaging with and considering is, can we create online learning experiences that students can navigate on their own? And this is something as simple as, like, I was just on with a group in Chicago, a group of history teachers in Chicago, and we were talking through, like, if we're going to give students a reading to engage with, or we're going to give them a short story to read, we can't simply take the link to that reading, drop it into Google Classroom, and keep our fingers crossed and hope everyone can navigate it and read it. But what can we do? I can chunk that into smaller pieces. I can put that into an environment like Google Slides. I can put a little video of me right next to the reading that's going to prepare the student of what they're about to read, right? Set the context for them. Even if we're talking lower elementary, this could be a scenario where there's sight words on and I'm referring to one tool we can use over and over again across all grade levels and content areas. Maybe there's a Google slide with sight words that are on the slide. And right embedded in that slide is the teacher that's reading through the sight words, using them in context, providing them in a sentence, clarifying the meaning of the word, and then prompting students to work independently to use those sight words in a sentence of their own. Whether they're practicing kind of orally in front of their laptop, or if they're able to they're emerging writers and they can start to write them down. And oftentimes what I'm even suggesting to, especially with this lower elementary grade, is so much of the work should be done in an analog space. So even though they're working online, it is so reasonable to say they have a dry erase board and they have a paper notebook, and that's where they're engaging with most of their work, but we can present the experience digitally to guide the students through that with really clear navigation, even adding little numbered bubbles of start here and then transition here. And these are some of the models that I've showed the teachers when I was working with them. So these are some of the things when I talked with them about designing high quality experiences. Can we create like one unified location? And I'm even proposing the prospect of, can we make something that kids can open on Monday and they're working through that for the entire week? It's a lot of work and preparation up front. Like normally, I mean, when I was a history teacher, I would basically prepare, I would have a vision for the unit. And I think most teachers have a vision for the experience. But generally, we're preparing day to day and we're getting our materials ready. But in an online environment, I think we have to think way bigger than that and think about the week. And can we build a unified location for the week where we can do things like minimize the number of clicks, present the task or the directions or the content or the challenge in multiple modalities, audio, video, text, visual, and all of that is very possible even with one simple tool like Google Slides. Can we embed checks for understanding? So one of the biggest challenges is providing effective feedback for students in an online environment. Like it is the elephant in the room. Assessment and feedback is really challenging in an online environment, but there's reasonable approaches to have like these embedded checks for understanding where that can give the teacher insight into what do the kids know and not know right now. And then that information can be used to better inform them if they're going to get on a live call like this, or when they have the students face-to-face. So I think a really well-designed experience online can almost enhance what's going to happen in that face-to-face environment. And then the last one that's above my shoulder right here is removing barriers. So and I'll get into this a bit later about the idea of assessment and like how challenging assessment is. And oftentimes we're putting like unreasonable barriers in front of the students because we're thinking of assessment in a really confined way. And I think via technology, it's really interesting. I almost look at this in terms of we have opportunities. Like there's plenty of challenges, right? But there are so many opportunities when we think about using technology. And again, not to like belabor the point, but I think of my own learners here, my 8-year-old and 6-year-old learners, where at the end of every other day, we're going into, again, redundant tool, Google Slides, and they're adding a video entry into their digital portfolio where they're reflecting on what they learned that day. What new skill have they developed? What problem are they grappling with? What's a really interesting question they've developed? So it's not only removing barriers, but it's identifying opportunities for students to show what they understand in a way that we might not be able to in a packed classroom with 20 students where you can't really pull these sorts of things off. So these are, again, I want to present to you a lot of the thinking behind what does high quality online instruction look like, a lot of the thinking behind like what are some of the ideas I shared with the teachers to try to get their thinking shifted in terms of how can we make this a meaningful and a successful experience. Oh, that's a great question. So really interesting question in the chat, Mary. And one of the ideas I just kind of alluded to is that something like at the end of the day or at the end of the week, having something like a video reflection where, especially with younger students, where, you know, typing might be the barrier, right? I think about first, second, third graders, they might be working on like a Typing Without Tears program and emerging with their comfort level around typing. So if that's an unreasonable barrier, there are very simple tools where a student can click a button and the front-facing camera turns on and they're able to talk through a prompt that the teacher has given them. Use their sight words, for example, in a few sentences to show that they're kind of developing comfort level with that new vocabulary. Or even something as simple as like holding up a piece of paper that has number bonds that they've worked on, and they can talk through the groupings that they've identified on that piece of paper. And that might be a better measure of understanding, especially in an online environment, than going something to like, you know, just a digital space where it's clicking on multiple choice questions. It's not that those are not valuable, is that there's opportunities here. So I hope that kind of addresses the question in the chat. It was, can we give some real practical examples around how could a teacher check for understanding that's not necessarily a test or a quiz? I mean, the reality is there's so many opportunities through audio portfolios, right? Through video portfolios, through using things like, exploring things like Synth and Flipgrid that allow students to reply to audio prompts or video prompts. And those can be really helpful tools to give teachers insight into what students know and what they don't know. So pushing forward with some ideas, and please keep the questions coming. It's super valuable for me to get a sense of what you're thinking or what you're worried about, and I'll stop along the way and check in on those questions as well. So another idea, and I think this has helped teachers really clearly calibrate, and even districts start to think about, what are we doing with the time that we have with our kids? So here's this kind of double layered matrix to think about kind of what can online learning look like. So if we think about bandwidth, and bandwidth is that vertical measure. So normally that applies to bandwidth of like the technology. So can the Wi-Fi support what's going on in an online environment? But I like to think about that also in terms of bandwidth for like human capacity. So a little bit later, we'll talk about the idea of like cameras on and going live all the time, and what it's actually doing to students when we put them in live digital environments. I mean, maybe you've experienced it in your own home, but like live video environments are super problematic, especially for younger learners, but really for any learner. And there's a burden that's put on like the human capacity or the human bandwidth to engage in these kind of top right quadrant spaces all the time. So high bandwidth, high immediacy, top red quadrant there. It doesn't mean that those shouldn't be a component of an online experience, but oftentimes, especially in the spring, and even what's going on now, I'll see it in schools where the online experience is only landing in the red quadrant. Right? And I think we're missing opportunities to address the needs of the learners, where if we think high bandwidth, lower immediacy, like that top left-hand yellow quadrant, pre-recorded video. So teachers making instructional videos with screencasting tools, pre-recorded audio, where a student can click and hear their teacher's voice in more of a self-paced environment. And I think there's a compelling case to like spread an online experience over all four of the quadrants. And I think what I tried to do with the teachers is to get them to think about, what percentage of my class is landing in each one of these? What percentage of my class is landing in live video calls? What percentage of my class is landing in pre-recorded or self-paced discussion forums, or pre-recorded audio that students can engage with when they're capable and comfortable? And again, I think about younger elementary learners. Right, it was really interesting in the spring when a lot of feedback I was hearing was, I sat my 6-year-old in front of the Zoom call for 2 hours and like it didn't go well. And I'm thinking like, of course it didn't go well. Like they're not built to do that. No one's built to do that. But can we allow them through a well-designed self-paced experience to be able to listen, hear, connect, watch, maybe a little bit of reading, working offline, working self-paced, kind of navigating the experience, and then really carefully selecting, when do we go to the red quadrant? Like, what's the use of the red quadrant time? And that leads us right into the next idea that I'd like to share. And this has to do with really thinking about synchronous and asynchronous work. Right? So if we think about asynchronous work, there are certain things that work really well when we're thinking about online learning and the asynchronous experience. So students absorbing new content. Right? Maybe watching an instructional video on how to work with arrays and turn that into a multiplication problem. Right? Watching a short video where they're learning about a new idea like the water cycle, and then the teacher is asking them to reflect on their understanding of that new content. Even mini formative assessments, check-ins, and practice, those are all like really high quality use of the time in an asynchronous or a self-paced environment. But if we also consider, okay, in an online environment, what works really well synchronously? And synchronously, what we mean is a live call like this, or even face-to-face synchronous. So small group discussions, whether you're leveraging digital breakout rooms or you're doing it in a face-to-face environment. Using that time for check-ins, using that live time for feedback, using that live time for kids to share their understanding and have small group discussions. So oftentimes what I saw was, and I think what's happening and people are developing awareness and comfort with this, is that high quality online learning doesn't necessarily equal synchronous calls for every experience. So the teaching of new ideas, while younger learners might need a little more of that kind of live interaction and the explanation and clarification of new ideas, oftentimes after that initial pass on the new idea, that can be explored in a self-paced asynchronous environment. I also think it's a more healthy experience for the student to be able to get up and walk away and not have to be kind of on demand in that high red corner quadrant for a high percentage of the day. Like, I don't believe, and it pans out with kind of best practice and research, I don't think that's necessarily the best use of the time. So more questions are coming in. And so interesting questions on fast finishers and how we encourage them to slow down, especially during those independent practices. So the question rolls in. Again, this is, you're not the only one who's posing this question. I'm hearing this all over the country, is like, hey, I was told that this should be a 45-minute experience and it's taking 5 minutes. Like, what do we do now? And I don't think it's a case of adding more. I think it's a case of the teacher kind of learning over time and calibrating that and getting feedback from the learners and from the parents. And kind of, it's hard to map it out. Like in a face-to-face environment, when we're in class, it's easy to map it out and go, I can reasonably anticipate that this is going to take 25 minutes for us all to work through. But the reality is, when the student's at home and they can focus on that with little distraction, the pace at which they can work through it could skyrocket. So there's no silver bullet to solve that problem of students finishing quickly. I think what we might have to start to embed, and like we've talked about with Dr. Scollins and Dr. Sullivan, is like realizing over time, am I building something that is reasonably having the student engage with it for 30 minutes? Or am I designing something that the student can reasonably complete? And oftentimes it's on the other side as well. We think students can complete it in a reasonable amount of time, but it's taking way longer than that. But I think it's also encouraging the student to slow down through the design of the experience. So instead of having them race through it totally independently, it's building in those stopping points, like, I'm gonna have you stop, think about this idea and reflect right now. Or I'm gonna have you stop, think about this idea and pose a few questions in your paper notebook, for example. And it's really carefully thinking about how we can blend these two ideas together. So this to me, this graph here, the previous one, the previous table, and this one, I think it's really important to consider and like carefully reflect on what are we doing with the time. And I think that's one of the biggest lessons that educators across the country are learning, is how do I think about the use of my time now in a way that I didn't think about it before. So face-to-face interaction is the most valuable commodity. It's the most precious time that we have right now as educators. And what is the best use of that face-to-face time? I honestly do not believe the best use of that time is by teaching content in a live synchronous experience. It doesn't mean that we won't have to periodically. It doesn't mean that can't be a component of the experience, but that synchronous time, whether it's through Zoom or Google Meet or face-to-face, I truly believe, and this is the message that I think anyone who's taught online at all and had any opportunity to connect in live calls, is that we really have to think about that time as making connections, providing check-ins, providing effective feedback, hearing what students know and what they don't know with that live time. And it's not necessarily teaching the new original content, because that can effectively, with thoughtful design, be built in an online environment through teacher-supported video, an embedded workspace, the video here and the content here and the workspace right below it. And these are some of the ideas that I presented to the teachers when I worked with them in Cohasset a while back. Right, so this is where it gets really interesting as well. And I'm bringing this up because I know we have synchronous face-to-face time, and I know this question is brought up over and over again. And I think it's not necessarily the question, it's not the camera on-off question that I want to address. I want to take this from a different lens. And a former colleague of mine, Beth Holland, who worked with me at EdTech Teacher, and she does a lot of work with Edutopia and a few nonprofits researching like digital equity. And Beth wrote a really interesting piece recently at an online journal called Getting Smart. And she kind of investigated this idea of camera on and off. And I think the little highlighted black text here is the important one here. You know, asking students to sit for hours in front of a screen, asking students to stay focused in that environment. And then, you know, the lens is typically, we want kids to have their cameras on, but I think the better question needs to be shifted to, is synchronous, is camera on, is live video the best context for my students to learn? Like, I'm aware of the constraints at home. I have them here as well. I have young learners in my home. I recognize the challenges around like independent work. Like, I recognize those challenges. And at the same time, I also saw the impact of Zoom call after Zoom call after Zoom call firsthand, and what it did to their kind of like emotional well-being, like breakdowns, and like really kind of like even like physical challenges where, you know, we're in a Zoom call with 25 kindergartners and students might be getting called on one by one, and I see the anxiety levels rising. And when a student gets called on, the Chromebook gets slammed shut because there's so much anxiety that's being created in this environment. There's research that was conducted by MIT, and they're equating this when students are on a Zoom call or a Google Meet call for an extended amount of time. They're equating it to asking the student to stand up in front of the room, in front of their peers for the entire class period. Like, that's the kind of mental impact, the cognitive impact on the student. And there's also like concerns around students feeling like there's digital equity issues, there's environmental issues around this whole idea. So leveraging live calls is super valuable. Having check-ins, having morning meetings, having points where teachers can provide effective feedback, getting students into small groups so they can create connections and discuss with one another. But I think it can become really problematic if we do whole class, entire period long, or we're talking well into the 20, 30, or 40-minute kind of duration of these calls. And it kind of ties to this idea of that kind of 4-quadrant idea that I talked about earlier, where if we think about this 4-quadrant idea, I talked about the kind of price that's paid when we go high bandwidth, immediacy. We go into that top red quadrant. Not only is it kind of unreliable from the home environment to expect Wi-Fi to be up all the time, devices to be working effectively all the time, I think it's unreasonable to expect students to be able to navigate that environment all the time. And then again, it brings us to this idea of like, what is the level of anxiety, the intensity, and kind of the impact on the learner when they're put into these environments. So I think it's a really kind of well-designed plan to say that we have check-in, we can check in with the student. We have lessons that are taught kind of live and synchronously with a really targeted intention. And then the rest of the experience is self-paced, asynchronous, and the role that the technology is playing is to guide the student through that, to develop an environment where students can be relatively independent, feeling relatively successful in this online space. But that's going to take time for everyone. It's going to take time for the teachers to get there. It's going to take time for the students to get there. But I think if we abide by some of these high quality principles, things that I was alluding to earlier, like creating well-designed navigation, creating kind of multiple modalities of interaction, even creating spaces where students feel like they can be heard and understood. And whether we do that in a self-paced environment or we do that in a live synchronous environment, like these are the kinds of things that we can hope the teachers can start to kind of redesign and reconsider how they're exploring the content and how they're connecting with kids online. Now, this talk here, right, the discussion tends to be around synchronous versus asynchronous. And it's interesting that that language emerged like really quickly in February and March. Like, is our school going synchronous? Are we going live calls? Or are we, there's even districts that said we're doing zero synchronous. Everything is going to be asynchronous. And that's the approach they took. So this language emerged immediately. But I think there's another really interesting lens that we can take to think about like, what is the purpose and what is the intention of the digital time? And it's shifting a little bit away from synchronous, asynchronous, because that tends to describe what the teacher's doing, not necessarily what the student is doing. And here's the idea, and I'm not a super fan of introducing like educational jargon for the purpose of jargon. Like, that's not what we're trying to do here. But I think the idea is super valid and valuable. And every group that I share it with, the teachers are realizing like, oh, I never thought about it from that perspective. And it's being referred to as elastic proximity. What we mean by that is, instead of calibrating everything that you're doing in a digital space in terms of, is it live or is it self-paced? We take a different lens and we go, okay, here's the idea. If that's the idea I want my kids to explore, if that's the skill I want them to develop, if that's the ability that I want them to be able to walk away with, how close do I need to be as the lead learner or the educator in the class? How close do I need to be to the students? How close do I need to be to that idea? How close do the students need to be to one another to grapple with, understand, make sense of, and be able to work with that concept? So I think if you pair this idea of proximity to the content, proximity to the curriculum, proximity to the skill or ability, and you pair that with synchronous asynchronous, then I think it even allows teachers to have an even more insightful view of what are we doing with the asynchronous time, what are we doing with the live time. And what I mean by that is, say that there's a concept and the teacher goes, okay, I'm going to take that concept and I can package it up online, and I'm going to make this online experience and have the students kind of navigate this on their own. But if they haven't given much thought to this idea of elastic proximity, like how close do I really need to be to that to help my kids navigate it? So you're kind of calibrating the complexity of the idea. And if it's a newer idea, if it's a relatively complex idea, one that we need to be a little bit closer to, I might evaluate that and go, okay, that idea, I feel like I need to be relatively close to, so that's going to take place in class, or that's going to take place on a live check-in. If I feel like I can back away from the idea a little bit, I don't need to be super close to it. Now I might calibrate and go, that idea, I can reasonably present that in an online environment for students to navigate it independently. And I think instead of this kind of like binary synchronous asynchronous, if we add this perspective to it, I think it can create like a richer landscape for educators to think about what should happen in this domain, the live domain, what should happen in the self-paced domain, right? So I think this one can be super valuable when we're thinking about online experiences. And I feel like it enriches the perspective that teachers have about their decision-making process, because it's a really complicated one that they're dealing with right now. So there's two more ideas. We're going to be on time. We're going to leave time for some Q&A, time for this discussion, time for the voices of our leaders as well to share their perspective based on the information from today. Oftentimes, online learning, what the experience can be, is often related to video. Right, so video is often a critical component, typically pre-created video. So if you think back to the kind of red, yellow, blue, and green, pre-created video falls in that yellow quadrant. But I think it's really critical for educators to be aware of, and I think they're increasingly becoming aware of this kind of research. Typically it comes from cognitive load theory, right? With regards to teaching any new concept or students kind of learning any new idea. If they reach their cognitive load or their cognitive capacity, it almost doesn't matter what we're going to do. There is no kind of short-term working memory to engage with those ideas. They kind of reach their capacity for the day, and there's no space left to explore new concepts. What's interesting, if you take the cognitive load theory principles and you apply them to video, and this research comes out of Vanderbilt, it's the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. And what often happens is videos that are presented to students, they're overwhelming the two channels that students are using to consume that information. So students are watching a pre-created video and a self-paced digital experience, an online learning experience. They are consuming with their eyes that visual pictorial channel. They're consuming with their ears that verbal processing channel. And oftentimes both channels are presented at the same time, and students are overwhelmed with the amount of information that they're being presented with. If either channel is overwhelmed cognitively, they're not going to be able to engage with the video. So I think one of the critical idea here is that when teachers are designing kind of high quality self-paced experiences, they're thinking about that idea. They're keeping the videos really concise. More research out of Vanderbilt around the duration of instructional video. If an 8-year-old is going to watch a video about arrays and turning those into multiplication problems and writing out number sentences, we cannot have that video surpass that 6, 7, 8 minute mark, because the viewership tanks to about 40 or 50%. So it's teachers kind of developing their skill and their capacity to create high quality instructional video to support independent learners at home, creating them in a duration that's reasonable to the age of the learner, creating them in a way that they can stop and check for understanding, and students are active participants in that video experience. right? So we're trying to, I'm reasonably trying to cram in what could be like a 6-week kind of teaching and learning online kind of experience. And I'm trying to give you maybe some of the highlights or some of the big ideas to keep in mind. But there is one idea that I'd like to end with today. However, whatever amount of research there is with regards to teaching and learning online, it doesn't necessarily apply to pre-K to 12, because all of the research really points to higher ed. That's where it's taken place. So we can take best practice for high quality online learning and adapt it and mold it to fit with our younger learners. It doesn't mean it's going to translate over perfectly. The other thing to keep in mind is like, these are ridiculously unprecedented times with high levels of stress and anxiety. Like, I'm nervous about 9 p.m., right? I'm on the call with you and I'm really nervous and anxious about later tonight with what's going on with our country, right? And I'm trying to navigate creating a reasonable experience for my students, and the teachers are at home with their own family and there's stress and anxiety about the kind of the scenario that everyone's trying to operate in. So while best practice might point to all sorts of ideas, it's super critical and to keep in mind that best practice might say this, but we're in a pandemic. So best practice has to get molded to meet the needs of the learner. And if we're going to enter with best practice and high quality online design, like, that's the best entry point we can have at this point. But I think what we're willing to do and we're open to, especially in this district where the teachers have such fabulous support, is that we need to go, okay, this is research-based. This is what evidence points to, but we need to be really careful about what is going to fit with our students in this town, with our learners, with the goals and objectives that we have. And I think we're willing to shift that over time and shift our practice in a way that's going to support those learners. That was a lot. That was 41 minutes of a lot of talking, right? I'm going to like effectively pass out at my computer right now. So my whole intention with this is like, my goal and intention is paint a picture for what the target of the work is by the teachers, give you a sense of what they're trying to deal with and navigate with respect to the challenges that you're facing at home. I hope that kind of my own experience here with my own young learners can kind of validate some of the points that I'm trying to make. And so with that, though, I think I've said enough. Dr. Scollins, Dr. Sullivan, any additional thoughts or perspective or ideas you'd like to share with the group? Or we can even shift to like, hey, add questions into the Q&A and I'd be happy to like address those as best as we possibly can.
Sure.
Dr. Scollins, can I just say one thing and then I'll let you kind of carry on. I told you I'd stay in the background, but I just wanted to add, first of all, thank you, Greg, for that. I think it really summarized what our teachers are going through and how hard they're working to try to provide the best experience possible for the students. Right. You know, I just add that the teachers too, most of us are, and I'm in this boat, have young learners at home. And we know what you're going through from a parental perspective. We're super sensitive to that. And we're really trying to create a high quality learning experience while also understanding what you're going through, because I feel it. You know, I mean, my wife works full-time, I work full-time. We are trying to juggle, you know, I have 4 kids under 11. We're trying to get them in these environments as well. And it's hard. And just know that, you know, there are going to be times when we all have to just take a deep breath, work together and regroup. And if something's not working, we have to talk to each other and fix that and readjust and move forward. Greg, one question I'd have is, you know, with that stress on parents, because I think a lot of it is, you know, how do you get, with the lack of independent learning at the right. young level, you know, what's the best advice for parents on how to go about helping their students succeed and also stay centered on what they're being asked to do in a remote environment?
Yeah, it's super challenging, right? Like, I mean, I saw it with I had the kindergartner last year going through it. And like, to be totally honest, there were multiple instances where we had to say, hey, I see the schedule today, but like, I'm responsible for their well-being. And like, we cannot engage in the Zoom call today. Like, you're not mentally, like, you're not like physically, emotionally, mentally capable of doing that right now. And like, I think we have to be really honest about the fact that, like, to me, the priority is like mental well-being. like the impact on what's going on globally and socially. Like my kids are internalizing it. I have to read them every day and get a sense of like, hey, what are they really capable of doing today? And as soon as I see the stress start to elevate, like it's time to go outside. Like it's time to sit. We call it our cozy room. There's like 2 bean bags and a little fluffy like a carpet on the floor. Like we have to go in the cozy room and just stretch out and take a break. And I think that's honestly the value of building in the self-pace. Like in some ways, it's grass is always greener. Like it might be easier to say, what if we could just put them in front of the Zoom call for multiple 30-minute instances? But like I think that can have a huge kind of detriment on the development of like just the confidence of the student to be in that environment. Like this is an unnatural environment to be in for adults, let alone a 6 or 7 or 8-year-old. So I think it's recognizing like it's reasonable to take breaks. We have this self-paced environment in a way that like respects the fact that those breaks need to be taken for everyone's mental capacity. Even mom and dads or the caregiver, like, hey, I can't sit next to you and support you right now. I think we all should maybe walk away from this and then like get ready to return to it when we're all capable. And I think we have to like have a little bit of grace for understanding that. May, I really appreciate the comment in there. That was super thoughtful of you. So 2 questions. Is it so maybe this is more for Dr. Scollins or Dr. Sullivan to address this one if it's really like district specific.
It is. I think, and the question is really around, where are teachers? Are they all incorporating these concepts? We've offered and given them opportunities to learn. And just like Greg has said and I have said, it's a learning process for the teachers too. So I am walking around buildings, as is Dr. Sullivan, and I'm impressed with what's going on, but everybody's learning curve is a little bit different. And some teachers were more comfortable in a digital environment than others. So you're going to see a bit of a difference in what teachers are putting out. But we're going to continue to offer training and continue to help them grow. And what I am seeing for those that are really getting it, I mean, teachers are pulling me into their classroom and showing me what they're doing, and it's impressive. They've really taken what Greg has taught them to create those experiences for their kids. They're having a whole different mind shift around how are they thinking about how they educate kids. And so I think, they do have, Greg's given them some models that they can put their information in, some of the Google Slides, so that they aren't really having to think those kind of templates that Greg talked about. And I think that's making it a little bit easier for staff. And as for effectiveness, we are constantly monitoring it. And at the end of October, we're actually going to look at how everything is going across the board with our reentry plan. And so at that time, one of the things we'll be looking at, how's our remote learning going? And we'll be checking in with teachers, checking in with students, and really listening around what is happening and how is it going, so that we can make modifications as we go, because we are going to make modifications. There's no doubt that we're going to have to make some changes, and some things are going to go really, really well, and some things may not go as well. But I think as we experience that, we'll learn from the things that don't go so well. I think just because that sometimes makes us even stronger at what we do when things aren't successful, because it really makes you go back and reflect and figure it out. So I hope that answers that. Looking at this other question, I'm being the time clock at 6:48, so we have 2 minutes. So I'm looking.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm reading the question posed in the Q&A as well. I think maybe I'm having a hard time navigating the question or figuring out what the intention of the question is. If you could reframe that question or maybe clarify a bit, I'd be happy to maybe address it or help out. I mean, while you were working on that, to support Dr. Scollins' point, is that the digital technologies in one-to-one environments have been around for some time. Like this is not necessarily something new. The G Suite and Google Classroom, like these tools have been around, but it's oftentimes rethinking the use of them to support online learners. And even that looks different. Even the way that a teacher sets up their digital space, they have to think about it more carefully now. And think about if the role that you have at work, suddenly the time that it takes you to prepare to do that job triples or quadruples overnight with every other thing that's going on. It's like they're in some capacity, like the role of the educator has fundamentally shifted since March when schools got shut down. and everyone's trying to kind of like figure out that space and like, what is my role now in an online environment? What can I reasonably expect students to do independently? What should I be really close to? And what should I do to support them with these really complex ideas? And then there's even bigger questions around assessment. And like, how can we remove barriers to assessment and create meaningful assessments? You know, like the group that I was just on with, it was high school history teachers. And I'm saying like, hey, guess what? The kids have access to everything. They can open up any tab, they can open up any resource. And if you have a lockdown browser, they're texting their friends to talk about the questions anyway. So we even have to rethink what assessment looks like when kids have an abundance of information right at their fingertips, because we can't control that environment. There's so many moving parts. And I think it's gonna take time to get there. And like the question about how do we assess high quality online learning, there's benchmarks and kind of tent poles of how do you design high quality online learning, but it's going to be different in every community, and it's going to be different with different grade levels, and it's going to shift because all of that research hasn't happened in this context, and that's something really important to keep in mind.
Well, it's now 6:50, so I want to kind of wrap things up. We could go on forever. I think too, some of the questions, I think if you want to direct them towards me or your teachers, I think that's probably a good way to go. But you can email me at any time at lscollins@Cohasset, k12.org, and I can kind of facilitate any kind of answers, because I think there's probably a lot of questions that are out there. So anything else, Dr. Sullivan? Are you good? And we can, because we're gonna kind of shut things down for just a little bit, because we have middle and high school presentation next. Anybody is welcome to stay for that next part. But Greg, thank you so much. I so appreciate all that you have shared with us today. I know it was quick and you condensed it into 15 minutes. So thank you.
I appreciate the opportunity. Good luck, everyone. Like, this is super tricky waters to navigate. I hope tonight was helpful and maybe just gives you a few more things to think and talk about moving forward.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you, Dr. Scollins, for your work. You really led this very well and continue to provide great leadership. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much. So I think we'll have, if we shut down the cameras, give everybody a break, and then we'll be back on at 7.
Sounds good.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you so much, Greg.